Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present some of my research here in Erlangen. And I've never been here before, but I can already see that it's a very vibrant and dedicated community to explore several topics I'm interested into. So again, thank you for inviting me here. Today I will present a paper dealing with ghost stories. I become to be fascinated with ghosts because throughout all my academic life, I've been studying shamanism in the Himalayas mostly. And of course, whatever we may want to call a ghost, are actively participating in the ritual, appearing through embodiment. They are considered to be the source of some illness, of bad luck. So we could start by saying that they have agency in the daily life of the people. Now, the focus of my presentation will be on ghost stories, because as I wrote in the abstract of the lecture, ghosts exist also in a narrative dimension. They need to be made heard and visible outside of the ritual sphere in in a practice which is a kind of storytelling also. Ghosts have been part of the stories that people have been trading and sharing since time immemorial. So I will track a little bit of the trajectory of the Nepalese ghost from the sacred text, so from the religious and sacred sphere, to, we could say, pop culture in the social media. Before going into the detail, some theoretical notes. As you can see, you're probably already familiar with the notion of hauntology, which is derived from the combination of haunt and ontology. And it is a term that appeared first in 1994 in the work of Derrida. And the obvious reference here is the specter of Marx as the haunting ghost of modernity. But that expression, that term, hauntology, was also then picked up by scholars of cultural history and media studies, music. And especially I like to mention Mark Fisher with his work, Ghost of My Life, Writings on Depression, Hauntology, and Lost Future. And coming closer to history of religion, there is this very interesting paper by Bruce Lincoln and Martha Lincoln, Toward the Critical Hauntology, Bare Afterlife and the Ghost of Ba Chuk in Vietnam. The literature about ghosts and the ghost stories itself can tell us several things about life. Of course, a ghost, we know, is the spirit or a dead human. But the stories that we narrate about ghosts tell us many things about our life and about possibilities. They are characterized by, as you can see, uncanny, eerie, weird, but also ruins, violence, trauma. Wherever we hear ghost stories, we know that there is a trauma behind it. They tell us a lot about past and present, and also about silence and sound, or silence and voice. And this will become more clear as I go through my presentation. The central theme of ghost stories is, of course, death. And around the topic of death, we find intertwined or entangled dimensions encompassing the past, history. The history we read on book is a sort of ruin upon which we build our present. And then at some point, we solidify a narration of the past into a narrative we call history, which is also derived or combined with memory. And memory and history then are compounded to produce identity, collective or individual. So to start with, ghosts are interesting because they proliferate, we could say, when memory or history is problematic. When history emerges from a trauma, violence, and injustice. Most of the time, if you pay attention to ghost stories, They are stories about injustice, and ghosts are seeking reparation or vengeance in some cases. We can then differentiate between the metaphysical, let's say, the ghost as a metaphysical entity, and this has been defined by Lincoln, a primary haunting. But we also can discuss about secondary haunting, which is all the afterlives of the ghost, even inside human beings, memories, feelings, and thoughts. And these two dimensions are always called into dialogue during shamanic rituals, for example. I forgot to mention that during shamanic rituals, and before we saw in the movie also, there were this embodiment of external entities, which often include the dead, transformed into spirit helpers of the shaman. Ghost stories are also dealing with the uncanny. And here, Mark Fisher points to the fact that uncanny is the exact, not so exact, but translation from the German unheimlich, which is something that should be private and hidden, but then all of a sudden emerges. And with its emergence, it, let's say, provoke or subvert order. And this is the last point of this slide, because the ghost stories are also dealing with power and order. Ghosts are like voices who are in somehow trying to subvert narrations. Power is, or order is controlling the past, producing narrative about history. But sometimes the ghost stories subvert the very same narrative. So we could say simply that ghosts are disembodied voices from the past, struggling to be heard again. And in doing this, they still maintain an agency. The ghost is a sign of a past that is not going quietly away, but it's something which is keeping knocking at our door or at the windows, as in many ghost stories that we can read from literature from around the world. So more basically, a ghost is a dead human being. In this is different from spirits or deities and other class. So sometimes the dead also can become deities at some point. On a general level, we could say that dead human beings can turn into ghosts after they died, but they can also turn into ancestor. And this is the first great divide between these two kinds of the same dead human can have different roles and functions in human societies. Of course, this transformation takes place through funerary rituals. And most of the time, especially in South Asia or in Nepal, in my specific case, a ghost is produced by the failure or wrongdoings during the funeral ritual. If the ritual is going on smoothly, the dead will become an ancestor and will become a protective figure. And in this sense, it will be like tamed, controlled, institutionalized, as supporting the order, the social order as well. In a word, is kind of conservative presence most of the time, because there could be exceptions too. On the other hand, a particular category of death will refuse, not by their choice, but due to conditions, to be and settle as ancestors. And they will become typically what we define as a ghost, a disturbing presence, the uncanny, which has been removed and then suddenly come back again. Because also the ancestors can come back, but only in during different specific phases of the calendar or of the year, and they have communication in a more, like, say, stable way, while ghost is more unpredictable. So we could also start to define the ghost as untamed, subversive, and linked with some kind of disorder. Now, this as a general rule, but in my presentation, when I will tell you about some of the stories, we will see that also the ghost can also differentiate between some ghosts who are more supportive of the order and some who are more. An example about what I was just saying from South Korea, where I was in January to film some shamanic rituals in the island of Jeju. Jeju was the place where in 1948 there was an insurgency, and to quell that insurgency, the army exterminated a lot of villagers. And now, until 20 years ago, it was forbidden to even to mourn those people who were dead. But on the other hand, the shamans in the island were very active to keep them pacified, to appease them. And now a process was started to transform those reckless dead into figures, stable figures, institutionalizing them through the construction of this. It's the Peace Park. It is called. It is a memory peg to bear witness to the horrible violence that was done against the villagers, as a way to compensate the injustice of these people being killed. But as I said, it was forbidden to even mention them until 20 years ago. And in some places, you can still find graves, unmarked graves, especially of children. Some of the children have no names. Nobody knows who is hidden there. So in the Peace Park Mausoleum, the dead are being transformed into some institutional dead. But on the other side, on the island, you can see there are a lot of graves of, in this case, children grave, and people still bring to them toys, small toys, after 60 years to keep them more or less. So this is basically a picture mapping the transformation, so-called ghost, into institutionalized figures. On the contrary, before they were more wild and disturbing presences, pointing to historical injustice that was committed on that island. Same is that something similar is happening in Nepal. In some areas where the Nepal between 1996 and 2006, there was civil war and many people were killed. So in some areas, the so-called martyrs of the revolution have been enshrined into this form of institutionalized. Coming closer to the topic of my specific lecture for today, we are moving into the cultural landscape of Nepal, and Nepal is part culturally of the South Asian landscape, even cultural landscape. So the terminology to describe these entities is shared in Nepal, and there are several words to describe different kinds of there is Pret, Pishach, Vetal, but the most used is Bhut, which, as you can see from the Sanskrit dictionary, several Sanskrit dictionary, it has something to do with having been and with the past. You can see become, been, past, gone, former, but also the name of a ghost, goblin, demon, the past, fact, reality, welfare. So there is this also semantic ambiguity with the term Bhut, which means past, ghost, but also fact. So there is a deep link between all these dimensions. It has been said that the dead is more scary than death itself because it is contextually absent and present at the same time. So this is the disturbing, the uncanny presence of the ghost that is disturbing to people. And because at the same time, a partake of radically different dimensions. This belief is grounded on the idea that in our body, we have a principle can be detached and survive the physical death of the body. No? And in this sense, the ghost is also a transcultural figure or globally, everyone can understand when we say ghost, what we're talking about. So there are some, we could say, constant elements that we find. And the South Asian ghost makes no exception to it. First of all, when a person dies, three main reasons are usually given becoming a ghost. The so-called bad death, dying with violence, dying before your time has come, or committing suicide, or dying during childbirth. In several cultures, these are sure elements that could point to becoming ghost in the afterlife. A bad death in itself could be a legitimate reason for the dead to stay back, to come back, or to refuse to move on in order to punish a culprit, avenge some injustice, repay a debt, or simply to reenact constantly a specific set of action. In many stories, we have the ghost doing the same thing over and over and over until someone is finding the body, the remains, and performing the correct funeral rituals, so liberating the entity. Times and places of ghostly apparitions are extremely variable across cultures. While the majority of them take place in deserted and lonely places, like solitary country roads or paths, ruins, empty houses, graveyards, forests, locations where ancient battles were fought or crimes committed, usually at night time. Mapping ghost stories, we also find that we have stories detailing encounters in broad daylight, in urban centers, in crowded streets, or while at work. Other elements marking encounter with ghosts involve the displaying of what could be defined supernatural skills like knowledge of future events or knowledge of past events, ability to move objects around, the power of mind reading, shape shifting, inflicting pain, and so on. Now, I could elaborate more on this, but because every specific context or reference have detailed the description of all of these. In Nepal, popular beliefs about ghosts are embedded in theories and worldviews about the afterlife, influenced obviously by Hinduism and Buddhism. So there is a belief in reincarnation, in the effects of karma. And then we have also another layer constituted by, like we could say, a magmatic vernacular substrate, including animistic practices or mediumship and oracular beliefs about the afterlife, with a lot of local adaptations, reflections, appropriations, and translations from one set of ideas to the other. For example, in Buddhism, it is possible to reincarnate into a ghost. So the ghost is one of the 6 possible afterlife that one could have, according to one's own karma. It's not something in between life, it's another. You can reincarnate into a ghost. In the South Asian context, influenced by Hinduism, it is a major belief that a person becomes a ghost and continue as a ghost after dying for a time which is determined by the amount of karma that he has produced before moving to a next life. Other words that you can see here, like pret, or preta in Sanskrit, but in Nepali and Hindi is pret, indicate a particular class of being, which is the hungry ghost. Those who are still in need to, or they still crave for human food, they have desire, they have flesh desire. And they are usually depicted as being with a swollen belly and a very tiny mouth, devoured by a constant hunger. And they are always mentioned together with other class of evil spirits like the Pishach and the Vetal, which are known to stalk and prey over human beings in order to feed on blood and flesh. And those are responsible of illness and death. And this is why they are always present in shamanic healing rituals, because most of the time people say that the fever consuming them, the headache, the fear that they feel, the depression, is the effect of being haunted by a ghost. In sacred text, Hindu and Buddhist sacred literature is an ocean in itself, so we have no time to discuss in detail, but I will make just 2 examples. In the Brahmanda Purana, a text composed between the 4th century and the 11th century, we have pages and pages of descriptions of the booths. And the booths are linked with one of the major gods of Hinduism, Shiva. Shiva is the god of destruction in Hinduism, and among his many names, he is also called Bhuteshvara, the lord of the booth. So part of his host, we have several beings described, as you can see: stout, lean, tall, dwarves, short ones, upright ones, those with hanging ears, those with suspended lips, those with long dangling tongues, those with small bellies, single-eyed, ugly ones, with hanging hips, with stout calves, black ones, white ones, blue ones, white-faced ones, red-faced ones, those of tawny color, those of assorted colors, smoke-colored, those who have reddish noses, those with hairs, those with hair standing on ends, those with serpents as their sacred thread, those with many heads, those with no feet, those with a single head, those with no heads, and so on, pages and pages. We don't need to. They are part of the retinue of Shiva, and they are known to roam at night around graveyards or the cremation grounds, because most of the time in India, in South Asia, bodies are cremated. And to cross the path of one of these spirits or entering its domain is to be considered like the main root cause of developing a sickness. In Nepalese folklore, the term Bhuta denotes an entity not necessarily malevolent, but often the victim of bad death. And as I said before, even the wrong performance of funerary rituals is enough to transform one dead into pret, instead of transforming him into a pitre. The words are very similar, but the preta is angry ghost, pitre is the ancestor. Buddhist literature also have a very detailed descriptions of ghosts. There is one section of the Pali Canon, the Petavatu, probably composed as earlier as the 3rd century before current era. Petavatu is the stories of the Preta, and here we have several ghost stories. Just one excerpt here. They are used as examples. What monk should not do. And if you read the description, it's very similar to Dante's Divina Commedia, the comedy, the contrappasso. I don't know how to say it in English, the contrappasso. Whatever you do will have an effect in your punishment. And so, for example, there is a story called The Stinky Mouth, and there is a monk meeting a ghost with the mouth full of worms. And he say, what have you done in your previous life? And the ghost say, I was an evil monk and insulted others using bad words. I pretended to be a good monk, but I was not, and I was always engaging in bad talk about the others. And so now, this is what I have to suffer in my next life, in my ghost life. So we could say they have a moral. The ghosts are also used as a moral instrument to teach, let's say, a good way of life, to behave. And then there's another dimension. You know that South Asia was part of the British Empire, and there is a literature which has been defined the Imperial Gothic. There is, let's say, a series of narrative works, of literature works, dealing with the most uncanny aspect of South Asian culture from a Victorian, from the point of view of Victorian culture, Victorian society. Read especially this very interesting book, The Rule of Darkness, British Literature and Imperialism. But it is also a nice collection of ghost stories, the Penguin Book of Indian Ghost Stories, including tales from Mark Twain, Kipling, and others. And then there is, coming closer to us, there is this book by Katarzyna Ankuta in the Imantas Valanciunas, South Asian Gothic, Haunted Cultures, Histories, and the Media. Because somehow all the ghost stories narrated today replicate some tropes from the sacred text, but also from Victorian literature. Now, in Nepal, I was doing my research for my PhD, and I used to hang out with, we could say a shaman, but it was a bombo, as it was called among the Yolmo. And one day, we were sitting close to the Bodhnath Stupa, which is a very famous Buddhist monument, and people circumambulate the monument every evening, actually all day. Every day. And then at some point we were sitting there just looking at the people, and the shaman at some point told me, you see all these people going around the stupa? I said, yes, of course I see them. Well, not all of them are alive. Some of them are already dead, but they keep coming here. I took this picture, but of course this was just because I was not good enough to take a picture, and the human figures have been blurry, but I think it can be used as a metaphor for what he was just telling me. So, as I said before, the Nepalese ghost concept is including element from Hinduism, Buddhism, and animistic cultures. And these are all combined together into the folklore. And when we find them incorporated in the ritual life, it is because the ghosts are the main root for illness. In India, when one is haunted by a ghost, people used to say "Bhut Lagna." A ghost applies like everything which is coming from the outside is applying to your body. But also fear can apply at the same. The verb is they use is the same. So fear, ghost, fever. There's something which is applying to you. You don't have hunger. Hunger applies to you. So it means there is agency from outside affecting you. In shamanic rituals in Nepal, these are pictures from my research in the southern Nepal, in the Terai plains. During shamanic rituals, the shaman used to identify the main root for sickness. And this is also interesting because the ghost causing sickness is always a ghost which is intimately related to the person. It is a family issues most of the time. So most of the people of the ghost affecting you are the ghost of your relatives, of your family. And this is the first exception to the rule that ancestors are always peaceful and stabilized and institutionalized. They can also be troublesome if you ignore them, if you don't fulfill. So during several rituals, when a shaman is possessed, he expresses what is wrong. And so in some of the cases, you can hear in these circumstances, you can find that, for example, there is a dead mother complaining with the daughter because the daughter sold their jewels after she died. And so the daughter is sick, and the shaman say, yeah, it is because you did this and your mother. Or a dead child envious of a newborn, and so making the newborn always sick. Or an old man whose relatives out of avarice hold a cheap funeral. So he was complaining with his son that and making him sick because the money they spent for the funeral were not so much, and it was not good for the status of the family. So these kind of stories appear during many shamanic rituals, healing rituals. And there is exactly the same practice. Every healing ritual is partly an exorcism and partly an appeasing. There is always negotiation. And in more recent times, all these elements have been translated into the social media, of course, by the new generations. The ghost story is a very huge topic among teenagers. It has always been. And in the social media, we find several elements which are deriving from the traditional folklore and religious traditions of Nepal, but also combined with elements coming from pop culture or horror movies, global horror movies, and uncanny movies from all around the world. And that is to say, there is a new product emerging from the intersection of different trends. I have many stories, but I don't think we have time to read. But I will point to at least some elements. Social networks have recently subsumed largely the function of oral receptacles of oral culture. In fact, the language in which these younger generation are writing is very much more. It is written, but it is similar to oral culture. And despite their written or more or less permanent nature, they are often employed to convey thoughts, impressions, and comments, which were once pertaining merely to oral communication and exchanges. As such, the social network provide a safe space where ghost stories are actually traded, exchanged, told, and compared between people on specifically dedicated web pages, blogs, or casual chats. Here we have some examples. You can see the sources over there and some blogs dealing with Nepalese ghost stories. The narrative experience of the ghost stories is then enriched by visibility and access to larger audience, which may also participate to the discussion, commenting, and adding elements, asking questions, sharing similar experiences. And what is interesting is that these spaces are naturally not linked to a specific locality, but they, let's say, open to transcultural interpretations, transcultural debate, and comparative discussions. Beyond the usual ghost story features, in fact, we find some interesting additions to the web version which seem to recur. Among these recurring traits, there is almost always, a preface of sort where the narrator often states states that despite being readers of ghost stories and blah, 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 they somehow justify themselves for not having shared their own one so far because they say they never believed in ghost stories. And this, of course, is also a narrative device to make the story more credible. And in fact, they always add their credentials as curricula of scientific subject studies and like this. The second almost constant feature is the explanation of a local custom and practices related to the story. And this is telling that the story is produced for an open audience, not a local one, in order to clarify to external readers certain local customs which may appear extreme or shocking. For example, in the case of Nepal, the reclusion of girls during the menstrual periods, arranged marriages, animal sacrifices. And the fact that in several parts of Nepal, even today, girls during the menstruation periods have to be removed from the house and sent in the fields to live in a shed is appearing in several ghost stories because several times it happens that the girls die there, or they are raped, or they got infections. So this is interesting because in these blogs, you can also find that the narrator himself or herself seems also implicitly criticizing some practices, as if to underline the belonging of a common, universal, cosmopolitan, educated middle class against what could be perceived as an excess of the local culture. It has to be also added that those who have access to internet and computers in Nepal are middle class, mostly still middle class and not village members, although this is changing very, very fast. So several of the stories I said describe this, I could say, structural violence against women. Several of the ghosts are female ghosts. So this is also very interesting. Ghost story always point to critical space in the society, which need to be addressed, or specific issues of injustice that needs to be or could be addressed, but not directly, because maybe it's too difficult to challenge directly the story. But the ghost is there to remind that something is wrong. Another stories is also quite interesting. Another story I found is a story that, and then I can read this, it's very short. A few decades ago, my grandfather was young and he was living near the airport. At that time, one of our relatives got a baby and she was hospitalized in Patan Hospital in a nearby village. So my grandfather got a responsibility of taking care of her dinner, and every day he was bringing her dinner and back. And he used to go by bicycle. One of those nights, as he was coming back home, and at that time there were no houses, it was just trees, he saw a lady on a white, wearing a white sari. He saw her from the back, as he was pedaling his bicycle. And so he decided to approach her and call her and offer her a lift if she wants, because it was too late for a lady to roam around at night. My grandfather was also afraid at the same time while offering her the lift. However, she turned towards him and she was amazingly beautiful. He could not move his eyes from her. She said, "Sure, that's so nice of you." She stepped on the back carriage of the bicycle, and as he was pedaling, he rolled his eyes down to the cycle chain, and he saw that the feet of the lady was facing in the other direction. So the lady had backward foot, which was a sign that was a ghost. As he reached home, he felt from the bike. After a while, he came back to himself. He was alone. He came back home. He fainted, and then he was sick for 1 month without speaking. So in the end, a shaman was called. He did a ritual, and then my father got back to normal, and he told the story. Now, this is also very interesting with the reference to what I was saying before about the structural violence, because the apparition of this lady ghost in white is usually almost exactly mapping the area where prostitutes were hanging out in Kathmandu, and several prostitutes were killed. So there was this overlapping with this figure, which in Nepal is called the Kichkani, and the ghost of prostitutes, so victims of violence. So these stories, despite being just a minimum sample of the materials related to Nepalese ghost stories coming from various sources, from classical to folklore texts, from web sources to local informants, highlight and touch upon several of the topics, which could be usually linked to ghost stories also globally. As the ghost of other cultures, the Nepalese ghost appears preferably in an isolated place, and regarding the time of the apparitions, despite a marked preference for nocturnal encounters, diurnal ones cannot be excluded. And very recently, there was in Kathmandu also a ghost in broad daylight, apparently. It was in the news. In many stories, I didn't mention it before, there is an obvious link with food. Usually in several of the stories, people engage normal relations with what they believe is a person, and then at some point they take the salt, and salt is something which ghosts don't like, and then the other person vanishes. So, or when on the other perspective, when the person meeting the ghost take out salt, the food is being offered is just some food which is not good for human beings. For example, contaminated by blood or human flesh at all. And food as an element of exchange between the living and the dead constitute the primary element of recognition between different realms of existence. Nutrition modalities, in fact, divide the living and the dead. And to partake of the wrong, prohibited food equates to damnation. It should be noted, this is also in other cultures. It should be noted that food rules lays also at the base of the caste structure in Nepal and elsewhere in South Asia, where they constitute the practical boundary between different social groups. But what was striking for me when analyzing a lot of ghost stories was the gender issues. Gender issues play a pivotal role in ghostly matters as well, because while the cause of being a ghost for the male is usually tied to the lack of funeral rituals, a tragic death seems to constitute the norm for female ghosts. And a tragic death which is often caused by uncritical adhesion to models of submission and oppression, like the reclusion of the menstruating girls, or the murdered prostitutes that I mentioned, or mistresses, because a particular set of ghosts is considered to be the lovers or concubines of the former aristocracy of Nepal. Before Nepal became a republic, it was rumored that the members of the royal family used to have a lot of concubines, and then they were killing them and making them disappear in the forest, murdered to avoid scandals or to prevent them from claiming rights or to prevent them from blackmailing the aristocracy. And finally, the huge numbers of those killed or suicide, or who committed suicide after unhappy love stories, for forbidden intercaste relationship, or in arranged marriages with violent men. As already mentioned, the ghost story is acting on a double sphere. In the case of male ghost, apart from the initial distinction I made between ancestors and ghosts, even for the ghost, we can have this divide. A ghost supporting traditional customs and social conventions and norms, usually a male ghost. And in the other case, and a ghost criticizing and obliquely, indirectly attacking the structural violence of the establishment. In this sense, the same ambiguity characterizing the ghost story is the very same ambiguity we find lingering nearby uncertain social boundaries and interactions with the ghost itself, with its presence, is challenging. It's the past in the present. Is the ruin, is the grief, is the mourning, is the trauma which is coming back. So different worlds, realms, and dimensions exist side by side, separated, but intertwined as well. As we, for example, know for the stories dealing with the food, the ghostly food, the exchange of food, but also the exchange of obligations, like parental and filial obligations, sexual relations, debts and credits. So among the causes of ghost presence, we surely find many stories also envy for the living and greediness for the worldly things. But yet, and not secondarily, also a just resentment for being victim of injustice. And finally, to come back to the narrative elements of the ghost stories, the ghost stories is a story, so it is a narration, and is also essentially something that has to be shared. This is why in my avatar I said a ghost needs listeners. There is no ghost story without its sharing. The moment of the narration could be tied to several factors, from the urge to share a terrifying or inexplicable event experienced, or just heard and then transmitted from mouth to mouth, page to page, or blog to blog, to the opposite end, to trick the credulous into believing, to make a joke, to entertain. There could be several purposes. There is also an entertainment element in ghost stories. And whatever the truth behind, ghost stories always reveal more than their surface value, conveying images and ideas not only on the story itself or about the narrator, but also on the general context of reference, and in particular on the critical areas in the context of a reference. In all this, we could say the ghost is like always at the crossroad about different possibilities, about the past and the present, the silence and the sound, and somehow it is also torn between different possibilities. It is us who can do something. So torn between different possibilities, the ghost still waits for a witness as an opaque reflection of a living past retaining its agency. And with this, I will end, and I thank you very much for your attention. And